Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and I made Diablo for Diablo I made Diablo for Diablo 4. Now you may be wondering why I'm making Diablo for Diablo 4 when the obvious villain is Lilith, and the answer is twofold. One, Lilith is pretty cool, but at the end of the day she's just kind of a sexy translucent horned lady with wings, while Diablo is a big beefy red monstrosity with spikes sticking out of everything. And two, I came up with the title of this video before I decided to actually make this video, and I made Lilith for Diablo 4 just doesn't have the same ring to it. Of course, only time will tell if going with the tried and true big red boy was the correct move, or if I'd been better off serving the thirsty side of the algorithm. Regardless, at this point I've built a big body out of aluminium and covered it in foil, so all I need to do is add a belt of wire and then turn that into a tail, and I'm ready to start bulking out this body with clay. Now Diablo's taken a few forms over the years, with his most recent form being the multi-armed, ridiculously horned ultimate baddie in Diablo 3, but I've always been partial to the slightly less exaggerated version of Diablo from the second game. There is of course Diablo Immortal, but we don't talk about that here. All this is to say that if you're newish to the decades-long battle against the Lord of Terror, and you're wondering why he doesn't necessarily look like he did in the last game, it's mostly because I didn't want to make that many arms. Because more than 2 arms means more than 2 hands, and hands are the bane of my existence. Otherwise, with Diablo's body mostly bulked out, I can start to refine some of the musculature and anatomical detail. I find it's good practice to get the body built up with vague references to how it should look first, before coming back through in multiple passes, adding more and more of the finer and finer detail. Fortunately, the Diablo design I'm going with is a mostly humanoid body with proportions that aren't quite correct. And if there's one thing I perfected in my years of YouTube sculpting, it's making characters whose proportions don't quite line up. Also backs. I'm confident in my back making game, though I'm not really sure why, since it's the only part of my body that I can't really see. I suppose I can't really see the back of my head either, but that makes sense too, because when it comes to making faces, the back of the face is easily the part I'm best at as well. Regardless, I'm glad I'm only making 2 arms. Now, Diablo's a bipedal humanoid, which means, of course, he's got a 6-pack, but don't worry, once I come back to add the rest of the detail, I'll make sure that it's a demonic 6-pack. Washboard abs of terror. Otherwise, with that finished and smoothed, I can finally get to work making his head. I'll start with a little ball of clay that I can then press and blend into his oversized neck before chopping away the chaff to get the correct size and shape. Otherwise, I didn't know exactly how I wanted to make his face, but I figured if I was going to be making him for the release of the new game, then I could probably stand to use at least some of the new content. To that end, there's a photo of Lilith holding what I assume is Diablo's skull, so using that as a reference, I added a couple pointy pokers to his cheekbones and got to work making a slightly more alive version of that skull for my model. Mostly that involves giving him a bottom jaw and eyeballs, but everything else kind of stays the same. Now I know at this point he looks like a cross between a decomposing pumpkin and someone trying to draw an Egyptian pharaoh from memory, but we're pretty deep into the trust the process territory, so just stick with me for a little bit longer. Once I've trimmed the jowls, I can add some exaggerated cranial ridging and drop a couple eyeballs in place, then bulk up the eyebrow to make sure he's extra animated in his anger, since that's a pretty important part of Diablo's personality. I'll add a few more ridges to his ridges, then poke a couple divots into his jaw so I can give him a spiky 5-piece chin strap and start to stab some teeth into place. I'll stick a tongue in place later, since I forgot to do it now and forgetting things seems to be the theme of this video. Then I can start to ugly up his face by poking and prodding it with my texturing tools until it looks appropriately gnarly. Finally, before moving on to his feet, I'll add a couple horns in the side of his head for future bony appendages, and I'm ready to add his toes. Like all good demons, Diablo's got chicken feet, which means a trio of sausages stuck into place, then blended together and poked in the tip to allow for the addition of extra large talons. I'll then add a little webbing between the toes and some extra scaly padding to the tops, and well, I mean that's kinda it. They're just feet after all. Which means the bottom part is done, so it's time to fulfill a promise. To make Diablo's abs adequately evil, I'll carefully sketch out a broken, scaly-ish pattern over the muscles while trying to mirror it on both sides. I also want it to be somewhat raised from the skin, so once I've got the design figured out, I'll try and press the surrounding skin down so it sits slightly lower than the rocky demon abs. I'll then do the same sort of rocky, scaly design for his chest, but with longer, more stretched out scales to exaggerate the pull of his oversized pecs. Finally, for his fingers, I would normally just make the fingers out of clay alone, but because his hands are so large and I know how hard it'll be adding detail to a long wormy dealy of unsupported clay, I've made a set of wound armature wire to press into his fingerless nubs so I can build the hands on top. With the armature wrapped in clay, I can then reposition them to a slightly more come-at-me-bro angle, then add lots of little blobs and balls until I've got some adequately veiny, gnarly-knuckled, arthritic-looking demon hands. A couple strategically placed veiny dealies around the biceps and on the legs will help make him look extra yoked, and I'm finally ready to give his whole body a healthy dosing of isopropyl alcohol. This will help to remove a lot of the fingerprints and soften some of the sharper tool marks so that I've got a nice blank canvas to start adding texture on top of using this little nylon brush. I'm always on the lookout for easy ways to add lots of detail, and while wonky homemade texture rollers work wonder for scales, these little nylon brushes brush back and forth across the skin are a great way to add little surface texture and make an otherwise flat surface quite a bit more interesting. Finally, with my skin textured, I can start to add the seemingly endless number of spikes. It seems like Diablo's got spikes poking out of just about every surface, and it really makes you wonder how he gets anything done. It's no wonder he's so angry, since you can only imagine how frustrating it would be going about your daily business, managing the bureaucratic nightmare that hell must be, all while having to deal with a constant chafing on your thighs, having your elbow spikes snagging on every piece of furniture, or having your ankle spikes stab you in the back of your legs every time you try and sit down just to enjoy your lunch break. And these are just his little spikes, since his back spikes are so big they need their own armature. One of the big reasons I chose Diablo over Lilith was because I'm lazy and I didn't want to make her wings. Of course, in hindsight, demon wings are easy and kind of fun. Spikes, on the other hand, are not particularly fun to make, and you never really just make a single spike. For instance, my boy Big Red over here has about 34 spikes sticking out of his back, ranging in size from ridiculous to only slightly less obnoxious. So once I've made 34 spikes in decreasing size and admittedly detail, since I was losing the will to live, I can start to stick them into my pre-poked spike receptacles. A copious amount of bacon bond will help to hold the spikes in place, and some little wormy dealies added around the spikes will help to make them look like they're extra appendages sticking out of Diablo's back. I made a couple specialty curved spikes that make up his collarbones, which I'll stick into place then build up so that the collar flows into them, and it's finally time to make my horns. I'll start by sticking a length of armature wire into a clamp so that I've got two equal lengths of wire that I can then bend into a pair of mirrored hooks. I can then wrap these into equally measured amounts of clay and start to refine the shape. With my horns looking adequately horny, it's into the oven to save the shape before sticking them into place in my pre-poked horn holes. And with that, Diablo is finally done, which means it's time to give him some color. And that color is predominantly red. Sadly, snapping my fingers won't turn him red, so I'll have to use the airbrush. Fortunately, apart from his chest, almost all of Diablo's details are in a darker color, so I can go ham with the red and completely coat his body without worrying about making my life harder later. His abs and his chest are sort of a beigey bone white, which is easy enough to apply since I've already got the airbrush out, but I can't be bothered taping sections off, so I'll have to repaint any of the overspray. A bit of sponge work will add some extra color to his bony belly, then I can paint in some red where I don't think he'd have scales. The red and bone white are a bit too vibrant, so I'll give his entire body a once over with a very thin black wash, which should pool in the cracks and crevices. Adding some easy shading, then a bit more sponge work with the lighter reds will help to give Diablo a bit of depth and definition without changing his overall red appearance. I'll then give each and every one of his spikes a simple black base coat. Using that same black paint, I'll add some fake scales by painting little dots between the various spikes around the body, then I'll load up my toothbrush with watery black paint and flick plenty of little dots all over Diablo, my desk, and my walls. Finally, to give the spikes a bit of texture, I'll give them all a slightly silvery but still mostly black dry brush, followed by that same color but with a little bit of red mixed in. Then I can paint his teeth with a nice bone white and give his eyes some nice yellow dots. Otherwise, that's Diablo looking dope as hell. Which means it's time to make a simple base to stand on. Now you may be wondering, why a simple base? Why not something incredible? Well, I'd like to say that it's because I feel an over-engineered base would detract from the main attraction, which is Diablo himself, but it's more that making all those spikes both drained my will to live and the hours in my days, and I was suddenly aware that it was Thursday, and I was out of both time and patience. So instead I'm gonna make a rocky base. Rocky bases made out of foam are my comfort blanket. I'm not sure why, but I always find making a rocky base is a great outlet for my frustration. With my base beaten to a rocky consistency, I'll add a layer of black paint mixed with Mod Podge to both prime and protect the foam, as well as act as the black base coat for my lava rocks. I'll then give the rocks a couple layers of progressively lighter gray dry brushes to bring out all the lovely cracks and sharp edges. Then I can pop Diablo in place, and we're not done yet because I still need to make the soul stone sticking out of his forehead. Hey Adam, I hear you say, why didn't you do this way back before you painted Diablo? Well, I assure you it's not because I forgot and only realized when one of my patrons asked about it, but because of some other entirely believable reason. Instead, I wanted to show you how easy it is to fix a glaring issue even after you've finished everything. In fact, pay close attention to this part here because it's really important. If you missed it because you weren't paying attention, what I've done is drilled a hole in his head so I can make a little crater to fit this temporary soul stone in place. I'll then cure the clay using a heat gun so that I don't ruin the paint job and melt the foam. Then I can remove the temporary soul stone and paint the crater to match Diablo's skin. Then using the temporary soul stone as a rough template for the size, I'll cut up the tip of a glue stick to make a teeny tiny transparent crystal that I can then paint with transparent red ink. The glue stick red ink combo will make sure it remains semi-transparent, and once the paint has dried, I can stick it in place in Diablo's forehead. And with that little hiccup passed through our system, now we're on to the glamour shots. As always, a big ol' thank you to the wonderful patrons who helped to keep me from making embarrassing mistakes, and a special shout out to my newest patrons, Ethan Boehner, Alwood Random, Nice Dice 8803, the Sherez Nerds, Knick Knack Paddywhack, James, Evie, Ellie and their grown-ups, Rex Luskus, Adric Lee, Nick Hedgie Christou, Zombo DB, Stephanie Bing, Eli Andrews, Atticus McQueen, and Vinosaurus. You are the overly muscular back that supports the plethora of spikes that is this channel. If you like this video, then go back and count how many times I said Diablo. Leave your count in the comments below, and the first 200 people will get a non-committal grunt of acknowledgement from me. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.